What's up, everybody? It's Daddy Rod. Peace and blessings to you. So glad to be with you on today. Second show. I'm super excited to be here and got a lot to talk about, so I'm not going to waste any time. I just want to just say thank you again for listening. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube page to follow when I have upcoming episodes, all what's going on with Onyx, with me, all that good stuff, all right? All right, so continuing off my last show where I kind of gave a little brief history about my life and how I got into leather. I wanted just to continue on about the history of the leather community, because that is probably the second most asked question to me. Like, Daddy Rod, how did the community get started? And how did like all these master slave, dom subs kind of things began to happen? So this is what the show is going to be about. So I can't go too in depth. I'm kind of drop those little nuggets for you so you know what's going on, all right? So to start off, the community really got its start technically from a lot of military. Well, it's actually a combination of two things. It's you got to go back into the 40s, the mid to late 40s, right around World War II, and near the end of it, where you had a combination of two worlds. You had motorcycle clubs, which was kind of like how can I say it the right way? Kind of the start of the community in the sense of just the aesthetic of it. So you had like, well, if you can imagine, if you're in cities where there's motorcycle clubs, a lot of them have vests, the chaps, those kind of like those motorcycle boots, those high boots that go up to you like their calves and their knees. And then, so that kind of gave you the aesthetic of it. Then you had to bring in the kind of more of the protocols aspect of it. That came from a lot of men and women who came from the military. So a lot of the men and women who was serving actually more of the men actually during that time would come home from Europe, and then they would come back to the States. So if you're in the military, you know what I'm talking about. There's those hierarchies from sergeant master to all this other stuff. Right? It's just a lot of titles, and from generals to all this other stuff. So that is where the protocols and kind of the hierarchy got its structure. Then you got those two mixed together. Hence, you kind of had the birth of the leather community. So you had back in the early 50s, there was a motorcycle club out of Los Angeles called the Satyrs, or Satars. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it. I think it's Satyrs, Satyrs. And they were the first like motorcycle club in the United States. And then you had a lot of people in the military who would also join these motorcycle clubs, and they would have like special events, back then, very private, events where you had to be invited to these events. So back in the day, the leather community was strictly like an invite only kind of thing. Because if you look at a lot of pictures and especially from stuff from Tom of Finland, which I'll go into later, they really push that hyper masculine kind of imagery. And back then, because you got to think in the 40s and the 50s, any kind of man exhibiting any kind of femininity was like because they didn't want to be ostracized and, depending on where you lived in the world, killed and all this other stuff. So they actively sought very masculine men. And so if you showed any sign of, femininity, you were not invited to any kind of private leather event. That's just how it was back then. And compared to now, that is kind of people, especially with council culture, they'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe they did that. But back in the day, that's the way it was. Because, you got people, some people can't grasp that, back in the day, they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have magazines at the time. And, for some of us of age, we had the classifieds. They didn't have that either. So it was a very secret kind of society. So it was truly invite only. And to be honest, very blunt, to this day, there's a lot of men who, when they think of the leather community, they do think of that very hyper masculine kind of, you know, imagery, and that's what they seek in it, and that's what they want in the community, you know. But as me being in the community for as long as I have now, I have seen the evolution where it kind of was, they still was seeking that kind of masculine man kind of imagery and look and feel. And now, you know, it's way different. You know, it's, you know, you if you go to any leather event now, you see men with leather and lace and all this. And back, you just can't even imagine how it was back. That would have not flown back in the 40s and 50s. But nevertheless, with that, going back then as the motorcycle clubs began to grow, you know, and then more people start coming home from the military, from whether it be, you know, World War II and other wars that happened, you know, post that, when you got into, because that was technically like the first like gay like organizations, the motorcycle clubs. So again, the first one was in Los Angeles, and then you had some that were in San Francisco. Then you had some on the East Coast, mainly New York area. So that's where like the community really started to grow. And at that time, you still didn't have a true leather bar until I think it was 1958, I believe it was. I think it was 1958. In Chicago, the Gold Coast Bar was founded by Chuck Renslow. And I'll go into him a little bit later, but Chuck Renslow is an icon in the leather community because he's the man, along with his partner, Dom, who started International Mr. Leather, which I'll get into later on. So after the Gold Coast, then you had the Stud in San Francisco that opened up next as being the gay leather spot. Now, there's probably other gay clubs that were welcoming to the leather community, but it wasn't like a leather club. And even back then, you had to have, there was like secret code words you had to enter into these venues. Because again, you got to think of the time and the place. This is like the 50s and the 60s. You know, homosexuality, I put it technically, that's the word they used, was not accepted. And so you had to really watch your surroundings and who you were with, because you didn't want the police coming there doing raids and all this other stuff. So it was a very, I don't want to say it was a secret side. Let's keep it real. It really honestly was. But as the community started to grow with motorcycle clubs and everything like that, then you had more of a kind of a, you know, surging, like people like, I want to get more involved in this. And the look of the leather, again, goes back to the motorcycle clubs, because back then, like I said, they had their jeans, the white shirt, whether it be a leather jacket with their boots. That was like the initial attire for leather. So you didn't have like the harnesses and the armbands and the vests. That came actually later on in the community. So later on in years in the community, I should say. So then you wonder, like, how did the BDSM aspect come into play? So that kind of came into play just with some of the, and I heard this from some people that I know who were in those motorcycle clubs. There was some type of initiation at times, some of them, not all of them, of course, but there was some type of initiation. So he kind of went through like a pledge process. So that incorporated some of this BDSM, whether it be spanking, restraint, bondage. And I was talking to people who were involved, and I said, y'all did that? It's like, oh yeah, that's what we did. So that's how that got started. And of course, as time went on, people started, you know, kind of exploring and getting more kinky and doing other stuff. And I get into that later on as well. But that's kind of how that element got into the community. So, because when you think about leather, for some people, you really talk to some leather men and women who've been involved in the community a long time. For some of them, the BDSM aspect wasn't even a part of it. I mean, and what drew them to it, it was more of just the sense of community, and they just loved the leather look, because it kind of gave you that kind of, for the men, again, that masculine kind of imagery and feeling that they wanted and they felt in themselves and who they wanted to surround themselves with. So that's how that kind of got started. So then you got the 60s, which was, very turbulent, but yet uh, time when just a lot of change was happening. We already know about the civil rights, the racial stuff going on, but also with the gay rights coming up, leading up to Stonewall back in 68 or 69 with Marsha P. Johnson. So then you had all this coming together, and then kind of going up into the 70s. By this time you had a lot more leather clubs, like bars, I should say, bars that were opening up. Because you got to understand, back in the 50s and 60s, there was no Eagles, which was synonymous with the leather community back in the 70s. So the Eagles started really popping up in the late 60s, early 70s in the major cities like LA, New York, San Francisco, Chicago. I think there was one in Atlanta that came later on, but in other major cities which had Eagles. So that was like, for some, the de facto leather bar, to go to. Then you got in the 70s, and then you had, actually, let me go back a little bit. What also brought in the kind of that leather look, there was a movie back in the 50s, I think 1953, called The Wild One, which starred Marlon Brando, who was a part of a motorcycle club. And he had like the mirror cap, he had like the leather jacket, the white shirt, the blue jeans with the boots. So during that time with the motorcycle clubs, and you had a movie with a very handsome, let's be real, Marlon Brando was a handsome guy, and who pushed this masculine aesthetic that was so different than the little white picket fence thing that was being pushed on by Hollywood. He really kind of triggered in a lot of people, like, I need to find out about this community. So you had that movie in the 50s. So then you go, now you go up to the 70s, and then you have that infamous movie Cruising with Al Pacino. So, and even though technically it wasn't a leather movie, it had a lot of leather, needed some elements to it, especially with the cruising and going to the back bars, the back rooms in the bars, and which some leather bars back in the day actually had a back room where you could do your stuff. And so that kind of brought a kind of surgence in the community as well. So this was like in the 70s. So the community was really kind of, gaining some attention, and people were getting more involved in it. And so then you kind of go up to like 1979 when Chuck Winslow with his partner started International Mr. Leather, and which is now going on its 43rd year now. And it's in Chicago during Memorial Day weekend. So it is like the creme de la creme of leather events. I mean, it is so iconic. Words can't even begin it. So if you've never been to IML, I suggest you go one time in your life. Some people don't like it anymore because they think some of them got too circuit boyish. The event got too circuit boyish, which to a degree I agree. But it's still a good time to go, especially if you're rooting a friend or a buddy of yours who won a leather title and they're going to compete international Mr. Leather. So then you realize also that at that time, the leather community was pretty much a cis, white, gay male community. Because again, it was invite only. And if you did see any person of color, usually it's because they were partnered with a white person. So, because again, being a lot of the stuff was invite only back in the day, look, even though they were gay, they were white, and they didn't want coloreds, let's keep it real, in their space. So it was a very gay, cis, white male kind of community. And that really started to change in the 60s, especially in the early 70s. So when, the popularity of the community started to expand in the bars, so then you had more men of color and women of color getting involved. And for those in the community, probably the first people of color that you really kind of saw out there kind of really putting a name out there with visuals and everything else were two women, and that was Jill Carter and Vi Johnson. And this is going back to the 70s, and they have been pillars in our communities ever since. I mean, if you are blessed to have the opportunity to meet them and talk with them, the history that they have is just amazing. And they actually have the Carter Johnson Library, which is based in Indiana. If you go to their website, if you Google them, you go to their website and they have like branches, like annexes throughout the nation. And now with COVID kind of being kind of subsiding, it's never going to go away. More leather events are now, about to open up again to the public, and hopefully they will be able to have their exhibits at these events because, I mean, they got magazines and books and photos of just the community back in the day, and just to see how it was pre-internet, pre-cell phone, all this stuff. I mean, it's just amazing how, the history that they have. So they were like truly opening the doors for men and women of color in the community. Then you had Mistress Meir, who was out there as well. She's a well-known dominatrix, and you had other men, but they weren't as out there like Jill and Vi and Mistress Meir, because they were literally out in books and magazines. You saw them. Then you have to realize back in the 70s, for those who are old school like myself, began before magazines and phones and internet. It's like, well, how did people ask me like, Daddy Rod, how do they know what you were into? And the way they started back in the 70s, I think it was 1970. And I don't know who created it, but they created the hanky codes. So if you've kind of seen some imagery of it, like you have different color hankies that represent a different type of kink. So like, for instance, red is fisting. Yellow is piss. Pink is dildos. Green is like someone seeking a daddy or letting you know that you're a daddy. So you had stuff like that. And then you had black, which is like BDSM. And I think blue is hard fucker, or was it bondage? I can't remember. There's so many. It was at that time when the hanky code came out, it was only like about 10, maybe 11 colors. I think it was about 10 to 12 colors. So it's very basic. And that's how you knew what someone was into. So if you look at someone from the back, if they wore it on the left side, a hanky color on their left side, that means they were more of the top, or they were the one looking for something. Let's say, for instance, if you had a red hanky on your left side of your back pocket, that meant you were fisting top. If you had it on the right side of your pants pocket, you were fisting bottom. Same like if you had with dildos, or if you were seeking like piss play. So if you had it on your left side, which is your dominant, you were a top pisser. And if you had it solely on your right, you were receiving the piss. Now, if you have it on both, that means you're versatile. So that's how people found out the kinks that they were into. So that's where the hanky code got to start. This was 1970. I think it started in New York, between New York and California, somewhere. But that's where it was first seen. And so that's how you found out like what people were into when you started going to the bars. And back in the day also, leather bars are very strict in how you came in there. They were like, no cologne, no perfume if you're a woman. They actually preferred you wearing no deodorant. You had to at least have had boots on, blue jeans, and a white shirt, or maybe a black shirt, or shirtless. But you had to have boots and all this other stuff, and a belt. Now, again, this is when also the leather vest started coming into play. It started coming into the leather attire. And so you would wear a vest. And I'll get into this in another show about the different type of clothing and what they symbolize and how you should wear them. Because I want to begin to talk about Amazon is a great place. But I tell people in a heartbeat, unless it's a quality leather store, don't buy your leather from Amazon. Support your leather retailers. Please, please, please. Please support your leather retailers, because if you're going to get into this community, it is not cheap. I will be very blunt with you. Because a good quality vest will run you about $150. Same with a harness. You're talking about pants and chaps. You're talking about at least $500 for some good quality clothing. I mean, pants and chaps. And then if you get something very customizable, with colors and all that stuff, it's going to cost you. So I just want you to realize that when I see people buy stuff like on Amazon, no. Support your leather retailers if you're in a city which has one. And if you visit often to a city like Atlanta, Chicago, New York, LA, San Francisco, which have dedicated leather stores, please support them. Please, please, please. So then you go to the early 80s, and the community now is actually really, really growing in popularity within the gay and lesbian community, because back then, even though it was much more of a male-dominated community, there was still a lot of lesbians in the community as well. And most people may have heard of Dykes on Bikes, which got started in 1979, which kind of gave them more of a visual, like, yes, we're out here too, but they were always in the community. Because again, going back to the motorcycle clubs again, so that's when you had Dykes on Bikes. But the women in our community, not all of them were lesbians. I don't want to think you had to be a lesbian to be in the community, but we had a lot of lesbians in the community who, at that time, sadly, due to just, again, even though we're in the gay community, you still have to deal with the sexism and the misogyny and all this other stuff going on. And you had some women in the community that, felt like they were being ignored. And technically they were, so they galvanized. And then you had, like I said, you had International Mr. Leather, started in 1979. So the women said, we're going to start our own. So they did International Ms. Leather, which I think started, oh God, what year did it start? Oh, I should know this, and I don't. But I think it was in the early 90s. I believe it was in the early 90s. So please forgive me if I forgot the exact year, but I know it was in the 90s, I believe. But they started their own. And if you've never been to International Miss Leather, which we call it IMSL, you definitely got to go to it, because it's the energy is totally different than International Mr. Leather. And the sense of community at that event is just so different, and it's so welcoming, and I love it. But the women in our community, whether they identified as lesbian or not, were very important in the community, especially in the 80s, because this is when also you had the birth of HIV and AIDS. And it really hit our community hard. And the women were the ones taking care of our men in the community, because at that time you had a lot of men who were just pretty much disowned from their family, because not only because they were gay, and then now you had, at that time they call it GRID or GERD or something like that. I think it was called GRID, gay related something disease, something like that. Then it changed to HIV, then AIDS. And and then if you look at some of the periodicals and magazines and other stuff like that and news reports, they called it the gay disease. So, because at that time, that's the community that was affected the most. And so the women were pretty much the backbone of the community back then, because they were taking care of our men who were dying. And the ones who survived, they will tell you they was the women who took care of them. So that was a very turbulent time for the leather community. So when you had like leather events like International Mr. Leather, and then you had other new events kind of coming up like Mid-Atlantic Leather and Claw and all this other stuff, I think they got started later on, I think back, if not in the late 80s, definitely the early 90s. But you're still talking about in the throes of HIV/AIDS drama and movement going on. So that was ravaging our community. So that was a way for us to come together. And, it's just, it was a turbulent time, I will admit, it was. And again, for some people, they can't fathom how it's like, well, still, how did you meet? So at this time, though, now you had magazines out there where they were publicized leather bars and events, whether it be local, regional, or national events. So this is where you come together and meet other men and women who were into leather and BDSM. And still, though, in the 80s, it was still predominantly a white environment. So and then you did see speckles of black and white, black and Latino and Asian, Native American, and etc. But it was still predominantly white. And in 1984 is when you had the first African American winner of International Mr. Leather, and that was Ron Moore. And he was great. If you Google him, good looking brother. And truth be told, a little history moment here. His sister, Janelle Moore, won International Miss Leather in the 90s. And they're the only brother-sister to ever hold the two top leather titles in history. In history, brother-sister. So good, and they're both Black people. So imagine that. Unfortunately, Ron passed away, years later, and Jamel's still alive. And but even after Ron Moore won, it took another 7 years, I think, 7 or 8 years before D. Cannon won. He became the second IML winner. And then from there, it took like 14 some odd years for another Black man to win IML, which was my brother, Onyx brother, Ramian, out of the DC area. So it was like, so when he won, it was just great because for a lot of the newer generation of leather men and women of color, it was like, then Onyx, which I'll get into now, which was started in 1995 in Chicago, was so, Onyx is very dear to my heart, because with the vision of Mufasa and the other four brothers who started it in Chicago, they automatically saw the need for Onyx because they wanted to create a safe space for men of color who otherwise would be instantly fetishized and or ignored in a leather BDSM environment. So, and a perfect example is sometimes you would have some of these leather organizations who would probably have maybe a person of color, maybe one or two on their executive body or board of directors or whatever, but a lot of decisions weren't trying to involve our people and trying to help our people. So for a perfect example is like when with HIV/AIDS, when a lot of money was kind of pouring into like a lot of major AIDS organizations, a lot of that money was going to predominantly white organizations that were helping like the white gays like at WeHo and those in Chelsea, those in the Castro and everything like that. But it wasn't hitting the Black and brown communities where HIV was really killing a lot of us. So Onyx, like, what we're going to change that. And plus, again, create that safe space for, because people are visual. So when if you're a Black man or Latino man or Asian man, Native American, Middle Eastern brother, and you suddenly see someone who looks like you, you're like, there's someone else besides me who's into kink, into leather. So that it's great to see, and being that, in Chicago, and which has its history there with Chuck Renslow with the Gold Coast, and then you have, International Mr. Leather. Chuck actually was a strong supporter of Onyx because he saw that we weren't represented. You know what I'm saying? So it was just great, that Onyx was started, and then as the years went on, and then you had the birth of the internet. I tell people all the time, the internet has been Onyx's best friend because you had like gay magazines like The Advocate and other magazines, local stuff going on that talked about leather events, and then of course you go to the classifieds to see like ads for stuff like that, but you rarely saw anything with us, And like I remember when my brother Graylin Thornton was one international Mr. Drummer back in 1993. I think it was. I think it was 93 international drummer in '93. He was the first black man to do it. And if you see him, you look at him like, oh, what a sexy man. Still is sexy. Looking good. Give it to me, daddy. Love me some Graylin. Lives in the Bay Area. Actually, he's one of the founding fathers of Onyx Northwest in San Francisco. But then you still, but it was still few and far between. So Onyx was really trying to say, hey, we are out there for other men of color who want to learn about our community. We're here. We're here to answer questions. We're here to educate. You can play with us because, again, I'm pretty sure that whether say for instance you're a black man, it's like you probably say, oh, he's a good-looking guy, who happens to be white or whatever. But it's like I prefer to play with my own people. And sometimes you go to the events, and most times it wasn't many of us there. And sadly, and still to this day, sometimes you can run into some black men, Latino men, or Asian man who you nicely go to and say, hey, how you doing, man? And they look at you like you're a ghost. And I'm like, okay, but they'll go play with a white man. And you're like, gosh. So with Onyx being there, we're like, hey, brother, we're here, So it's a great thing. And now with Onyx having 9 chapters throughout the nation, we have Southeast, where I'm at, Atlanta. You have Mid-Atlantic, DC, Northeast, which is New York, Deep South, which is in Fort Lauderdale, Great Lakes, Cleveland, Detroit, Midwest, which is home chapter, Chicago. You have Lone Star, which is Dallas, Houston area, Southwest, which is LA, Southern California, Northwest, which is San Francisco and the Pacific Northwest. And those 2 are my babies because I worked hard to get those chapters started. But I saw the need of Onyx on the West Coast, and both chapters are thriving. I love them dearly. Those are my babies. But with the internet and then with social media, with our chapters, we're putting out events, other men of color say, oh my God, there are people like me, and it's a great thing. I love Onyx, and they are actually one of the, few remaining leather clubs in the nation, because a lot of leather clubs have actually dissolved because a lot of the members have passed away, and a lot of them didn't do a lot of recruiting, let's be very honest. So you're like, oh, okay, we see what happened here. And but Onyx, we just continue to grow, which is a great thing, because I think it's a combination of just the internet and exposing us out to newer people and younger people who are, now in the age of social media and stuff, they see the imagery of gay and bisexual and men and women. We have a sister component, Onyx Pearls, and it's like, oh, I want to explore this world, and that also speaks on another topic where just people of color communities, gay and lesbian communities, trans communities, are finally getting in tune with their sexuality and they're accepting it, living authentically. So there's like, if you're living authentically, you want to try some new things. So we're doing a great job here. Down here in Atlanta, I'm really working hard to get, community back. Our chapter really involved in the community again. If anyone's in the Atlanta area, a lot of people know me already. They say, oh, we know Daddy Rod. Or we've seen him out, whatever, what have you. So, but, so that kind of gives you a little history of the leather community. I could go on almost for a good hour or so about a lot of different topics, but I'd rather have those discussions one-on-one with you if you ever meet me out. So, I just kind of want to give you a little brief history here and there about the community. But I do want you all to know that the community has evolved because, I will say this, there was like that old guard kind of thing in a sense. It was figuratively like black and white. You had the very uber masculine with the various types of relationships, you know, whether it be master slave, servant boy, daddy son, daddy boy, and then dom sub. And you did have that very hyper masculine aesthetic look that people wanted and strive to kind of give off. But now, you know, it's just so different. And for some people, it's hard for them to accept that change. I'll be honest with you. For me, it doesn't really bother me because it's just like I realize that we're in a different time now, and just because a man is a little bit effeminate doesn't make him less of a leather man. So you know what I'm saying? And especially for my trans brothers and stuff like that, you know, because in the beginning, it wasn't pleasant, you know, because I remember when our first IML winner was a trans man, the backlash was fierce. And, you know, his name was Tyler McCormick. I'll never forget it. But I'll never forget, though, that Onyx, we made sure we supported him because it's like, we know what you're going through, but we're here to support you. I'll never forget that. And then fast forward to 2019, my brother, Jack Thompson, who was birthed in Onyx through Northwest, one of my babies, became the first trans man of color to win IML. You know, so it's just, the community is growing, and I love it. It's expanding. It's becoming more inclusive compared to exclusive, you know, and which is a great thing. And, you know, it's a great time, and I love the community dearly. It's truly like my second family, and I'm just loving it. So I don't want to, again, go keep talking and I start rambling and stuff, but I want to thank you so much for watching this show and learn a little about the leather history here and there. Again, I could go on for hours about this, but again, I'd rather talk to you in person about that. So until next time, my brothers and my sisters, I love you all. God loves you. Let's love one another. So make sure to YouTube, follow my page, subscribe to my page. Also hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, Daddy Rod Onyx. Man, I loved your show. I'm going to subscribe. I want to do some live shows where you can, you know, type in some questions and I answer them for you. And I got some great topics coming up for you all. So you all stay tuned. All right. Take care. Peace.